Thank you, Kosti, for being here. It's a pleasure and lovely talking to you.
I'm delighted to be here, Paddy.
Maybe to kick off, Agentic obviously is taking the world by storm, or has the potential to do so. So from your vantage point as the global generative AI leader for Deloitte, what do you see, where do you see a maximum traction, and what are the areas that you see most interest in?
So look, first of all, for me, Caddy, Agentic is just the next evolution in the AI journey, moving from really prompting information out of AI, which is how most people use it these days, to actually AI being able to understand the information that comes back and actually make decisions before deciding what the next move is, effectively replacing us in some of these sort of thinking processes. And this can stem from quite simple automations. What we're seeing is actually those decisions going from what I might describe as traditional process automation to being cognitive, to expressing thought, and to be able to, in real time, make decisions. And as we go on that journey, I think we will go from AI assisting us in our thought processes to us assisting AI in understanding how to solve a problem. And that's, of course, a transition that will require some time, right? We will need to be able to do this safely. We will need to be able to understand where best we spend our time. But I also think, like many other technology iterations that we have seen in the past, this is something that we're going to be able to manage very effectively.
Absolutely, and I think one way to look at it is a lot of rule-based automation perhaps to address 50-60% of processes, and the rest 30-40% required human judgment. Maybe that's where agents, with the help of AI and LLMs, will play a role.
Absolutely. The metaphor that always springs to mind for me is, you remember when we used to travel 20 years ago, you used to arrive in a country and you used to have 50 border guards and there used to be loads of queues, Now you still need border guards, but you maybe need one border guard for every 5 or 6 gates. Right. And to me, that sort of simple automation metaphor is how I think AI progresses. Will still be needed for the 20% where human thought's really required.
Absolutely. So while technology, maybe compute and cloud, etc., has enabled AI to be a lot more democratized for enterprises and at price points which are much more viable, there are still a lot of impediments, challenges for enterprises to adopt AI in their daily ways of working. What do you see as some of those, and how do successful organizations surmount them?
So look, I think the reality is technology is moving at the speed of light at the moment, but organizations are moving at the speeds of organizations. And the impediments that we're seeing aren't necessarily with the AI technology. There's some fundamental challenges around data. Data is the DNA of these algorithms. They can't function without it. And as I've said in the past, Caddy, if you have good data, you get artificial intelligence. If you have bad data, you get artificial stupidity. And what we find is often when you do a proof of concept and you then unleash the algorithm on enterprise data, the data just isn't good enough. But the other really, really important factor is the human one. We forget that above every technology architecture sits a human architecture. And humans need to get used to this technology. Some humans think that is some sort of magical silver bullet that can solve everything, and they use it inappropriately. And we've seen, businesses get into trouble because their employees are using it inappropriately. But also, we still have a lot of people fearing it. And to your question as to how businesses can really tackle it, I think there's 2 key factors. The first is make this technology available safely to everyone. Let people play with the chatbots that we see today to understand really what this technology can do. And the second is, if you're a leader, lead by example. I know you're very keen in this space. I know you try out all the tools, and I know you tell your teams about it. I do too. And I think that fosters this environment of curiosity and wanting to learn. And I think, to me, that's probably the most important thing in terms of getting the human architecture to accept AI.
No, very critical points. And in one of our clients, we are actually trying to use AI to improve data, which then can feed AI, right? So how do you harmonize and enrich data much better? But also, I think to the other point, I think one of our futurists was sort of saying that earlier it used to be garbage in, garbage out. now it's garbage in, garbage squared, because
Yes.
that's the amount of garbage we create out of algorithms if used on bad data.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there's an interesting point around data, and that is that in the past we have seen that when models are trained purely on artificial data, or when one model feeds another model purely on artificial data, they actually get destroyed. So their performance goes down. And you know what I like about that is that there's something wonderfully imperfect about human data that I think makes it special.
Indeed, and as these models and data gets better, and as regulations come about, one of the challenges to navigate is also how do we ensure that AI is actually trustworthy? How can we rely on these to not only be within guardrails that we establish as human society, but also to follow laws, right? So how do you read the trustworthiness from a global context?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kadi, and also one that is very multifaceted. Because I think this requires really technology working together with governments and regulators, right? Because I think there's certain things that can be hard-coded. I mean, I think I should probably say that, first of all, we have come a long way in terms of model hallucinations. You know, part of the trustworthiness early on in our journey, and by that I mean maybe just even a year ago, was that you could never be really sure if the model was hallucinating or not. Yeah. That's not eradicated, but it's a lot better.
True.
Yeah. But I also think that it's important, you know, when you are training these models, to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, you have diversity of thought in the data, right? That the data reflects the many views of society, but also the data doesn't reflect views that I would consider to be outside of ethical boundaries. And then I think the same thing applies to when we then overlay this data in a corporate setting. You know, as you know, with our own platforms, we have put a lot of effort into defining what guardrails are acceptable for business use and what aren't. And often, in fact, you know, that is what our clients are most interested in. It's not necessarily the technology, but actually how we manage to make this technology safe in a business setting.
You know, if we look at enterprises and our clients, most, you know, let's say there have been 4 stages. One is, of course, exploration, which is figuring out about this, experimentation, which is maybe doing POCs and MVPs, then productionizing some of those, maybe 1 or 2, and then getting to an enterprise scale. The journey, how do you sort of view this journey, and what's been from your vantage, experience across clients, of their ability to go from experimentation to scale?
So one of the things that I think the speed of this technology is challenging is that relationship is no longer linear. Rather, it's iterative. So what we found, you know, in our own organization, as you know, is once we made this technology available to everyone at scale, experimentation started happening in all parts of the organization that we wouldn't imagine. And some of the best ideas that we have had haven't been from AI experts, you know, people that work with AI all day like you and me, but actually people out in the business saying, hang on, if it can do this really well, could it also do something different that we would have never thought of? So you then get back into the experimentation, understanding how we refine that and scale it. And for me, that's one of the biggest reasons why, you know, as we said earlier, leading by example and kind of encouraging that curiosity to experiment in the organization becomes so important. It helps in areas that we didn't think about. I mean, one feedback that we got from a number of people in the business is, you know, they've said, I've had dyslexia, for example. And so when I write emails, I have to check it 5 or 10 times. You know, you have no idea how much this technology has helped me, because it can autocorrect and rephrase emails. And so it's these little things that we wouldn't think about, where we're seeing some really great, both personal and productive gains.
Absolutely, and hopefully a lot more of the investments will go into creating applications and solutions which solve a lot more problems, given, you know, that we are figuring out how to maximize the use of the hardware that we have to produce more and more in the continuum of hardware and software as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Kadi. I'm very optimistic in that regard.
Thank you so much for being here and talking to us.